Well, good evening. This is a Valentine's card, by the way, in case you're wondering what John had lost. So, yeah, I'll just put that to one side. So, tonight, obviously, is the final talk of the week. Anyone give me a wave if this is the first one you've made it to, the first talk you've been to this week? Cool, well, welcome. You came on Valentine's night. Happy Valentine's Day. Anyway, so tonight we're going to be talking about the theme of love like this, and as we were saying, this idea of love dying for us and what that means. And whether we're Christians or not, we're probably aware that the cross is central to Christianity and all that it means. And there's a guy called Malcolm Muggeridge who's been mentioned. He was a journalist and he came to faith. He became a Christian in later life, and this is one of the things that he writes about the cross. He says, "One thing at least can be said with certainty about the crucifixion of Christ. It was manifestly the most famous death in history. No other death has aroused 100th part of the interest or been remembered with 100th part of the intensity and concern. In countries like Italy and France, for example, it is impossible to go 100 yards anywhere without being confronted with some version or other of the crucifixion. Since that Golgotha happening, billions upon billions of crucifixes must have been made, from exquisitely fashioned ones to tawdry mass-produced ones, from huge overpowering Calvaries to tiny jeweled crucifixes to hang around the neck or over the heart, but always with the same essential characteristics. A man in the last extremity of a cruel death, with lolling head and feet and hands viciously nailed to a wooden cross." And given that Christianity claims to be a religion that believes in a God of love, it seems weird, doesn't it, that is like the symbol of Christianity, this man, Jesus, dying a horrific death on a cross. And there are all sorts of ways that we show love to each other, aren't there? All sorts of different ways. Given this is Valentine's Day itself, I thought I would do a little thing on Valentine's Day and love and all of that, and so I went on Google, the highest authority I know for these matters. And I looked up stuff about how to treat people that you love. And apparently one of the things that's good to do is to give them presents. And this may be true if you already have a Valentine, or you may have missed the boat if you haven't got them something already today. But also, if you've got someone you like, sometimes a present can be a good way to kickstart something. So I went on Google, typed in Valentine's Day presents, got through 32 million suggestions within 0.18 seconds, but I've narrowed it down to a few, and I thought I'd split them into guys and girls. So this is presents for guys. So ladies, if you're here and you're thinking you want to get to know him, you want to get his attention, I want to buy him a present. Here's the first suggestion for a guy that came up. It's a rocket launcher alarm clock. So the little caption for it read, where is it? It says, "If nothing but a missile strike will get you out of bed." So I'm thinking about getting one of those. This is another suggestion for a guy. And you've seen this is a straightforward. So if you like a guy, let's say you like a guy, but his arms just aren't chunky enough for you. This is what you want to buy that guy. He's got his little gyroscope in there and he just does that with it and it builds up his forearm. So you could get one of those. This is my personal favourite present to get a guy, it's this. It's a giant leather rhino. So I think that is actually a real size there on the screen. And immediately, kind of when this came up for me in the description of presents for guys, I thought, really, a giant leather rhino? And then I thought about it. And I imagined myself getting back to my room after the end of a long, hard day, and just sitting on the back of a giant leather rhino. And somehow I know, I haven't done it, but somehow I already know that life will be better. I don't think there's any essay that won't be written from the back of a giant leather rhino. And it's only £600. So, ladies, if you buy him a giant leather rhino, I promise you, he will love you forever. Think about it. All right, and then there were some suggestions, things to buy. Right, these are genuine suggestions. I'm not making this up. Things to buy girls, right? This was one that came up. A pink hip flask. I'm not an expert in relationships, but if you're buying your girlfriend-to-be or your current girlfriend a hip flask so that she can fortify herself with alcohol at any point that she needs it whenever you're around, your relationship may already be in trouble. Another present to buy, girls. Now this is a voucher, okay? And the voucher is called, don't shoot me, girls. This voucher is called Standing Tall, all right? And the caption says, this gift is £190, by the way, which probably means we're not going to get it for you anyway, but it says, this gift voucher will allow the recipient to learn confidence, charisma, composure, grace, style and beauty from leading experts in the modelling and beauty world. So you can just imagine how that conversation is going to go. Here's a voucher. Oh great, thank you so much. What is it for? Well, I just thought that you could do with learning confidence, charisma, beauty from someone who actually knows what they're talking about. Probably not a good idea. And this is the final one. This is called a Control a Man remote. So, again, the caption reads, do you know a man who doesn't behave as well as you would like him to? This nifty device will make him succumb to your will. Buttons include, listen, talk about your feelings, multitask, propose, ego off, and mute. And it says no batteries required, but it's powered by positive thinking. So, there you go. There's a few suggestions. And we'll have other ways of showing love all the time. But in terms of when it comes to God and the way that He shows love, what we've said, what we've been saying all week is, what is it to come inside Christianity? And when we come inside the house of Christianity, we discover that the way in which He reveals His love is not by throwing presents down from heaven. It's not by opening up a window and shouting down, I love you. It's not even by poking us on Facebook. The way that He shows His love is He comes Himself. He is the gift to us. And the cross is the ultimate expression of God's love for us. But it seems, as I've said, a strange thing, a weird thing to talk about as a way of God revealing His love. And the only way we understand the cross is when we first understand what Christians mean by this word sin. And this idea that we have somehow made a mess of our lives, that we've somehow got it wrong, that we've somehow turned our backs on God. And sin is not a popular concept today. And for me personally, I have become convinced, against all of my will and all of my fighting and all of my self-justification, I have become convinced that I am a sinner, that I have got my life messed up and it is my fault and I have rejected God. And there were two things that convinced me of that. The first one is taking a really honest look at myself in the mirror. And sin, the thing about sin today is it's not that the word has fallen out of use. The problem is that the meaning of the word has changed. So what we often use sin for today is to describe something that is kind of like, you know, you see it on adverts for like Magnum ice cream or something, and it's, come and have a Magnum, it's so sinful. And it's this sort of like appropriate naughtiness that we can get away with. That's not what the Bible means by the word sin. What it means is we have turned away from God and turned in on ourselves. And at the heart of it is this sense of selfishness. So how we understand sin is that we have broken off relationship with God. We've rejected Him. And even saying it in language like we've broken off relationship with God, we're selfish, even that doesn't sound too bad, but the consequences of that selfishness are very bad. And the consequences of sin have an effect. And we have all experienced this firsthand at the hands of other people. So selfishness sounds okay until you're on the receiving end of it and you get betrayed, or you get hurt, or you get stabbed in the back, or you get accused of doing something you haven't done, or you personally are rejected, or someone slags you off, or you get bullied, or something happens. All of those things, we're on the receiving end of the consequence of someone else putting themselves before us, someone else putting themselves first. And I could, you know, if I was going to talk about how as a human race we've rejected God and we do things that are selfish and they hurt other people, I could easily go across the world and throughout history to find extreme examples of that and talk about people like Hitler and Stalin and Pol Pot. But I have a better example for you this evening. An example of sin is me. And the reason I think I'm probably quite a good example of sin, I could be wrong, but I think the reason I'm a good example of sin is because on the surface, I look okay, don't I? On the surface, like, I look all right. And if you walked around with me, you might think I was okay. No, I'm not there pushing in the queue at Starbucks. I'm not kicking little puppies across the street. I don't go around headbutting old people. Well, there was this one time, but it's a joke. I don't do that. I just don't do that stuff. And so on the surface, it might look like I'm okay. But have you ever had that experience where you open the fridge and the milk looks okay? And then you open it, and you pour it in your cereal and you realise it's not. I'm like gone off milk. You should come and have a sniff of me and you'll find out. And by what I mean is, under the surface, there's something rotten inside. And I don't think I think that because I have a low self-esteem. I never have had a low self-esteem. It's one of my problems. I think it because I have a realistic understanding of myself. I never used to, but I do more and more these days. And where I observe it in my own life is I see that it's not just that I do bad stuff sometimes, it's actually the part of me that enjoys doing it that particularly troubles me. That I can be cruel to someone. And there's a part of me, even though I know I shouldn't, that I actually quite like the way that I've made them feel small and made myself feel big at their expense. There's a part of me that quite likes when I reject others and I just do what I want to do. There's a part of me that is quite drawn to a life away from God, a life where I can just do what the heck I want, anytime I want. There's something that's attractive to me about that. When I take an honest look at myself, I can become convinced that what the Bible says about my rejecting God and the consequences of that reverberating in every relationship that I have, I become more and more convinced that they're true. And this idea of turning away from God and turning in on ourselves, what it does, and this is the ultimate consequence of sin, it separates us from Him. It breaks that relationship. We break away from knowing Him. The second thing that convinces me of my sin is not just when I look at myself, it's when I look at the person of Jesus Christ. And I compare myself to who He is and the life that He lived. And we've been going through that all this week in this book that you've got on your chair. And it kind of strikes me a little bit. It's like I've been going around different colleges in the evenings, having meals in the different halls. And tonight I was at Lady Margaret Hall, and they cooked for me, which was very nice. And when I was a student, I didn't do a lot of cooking, but after I left, I tried to cook, and my speciality was spaghetti bolognese. And I could make spaghetti bolognese. I would buy the mince, and I would buy dolmio, and I would mix it together. And that was spaghetti bolognese. And then there came one particular evening when Jamie Oliver opened a restaurant. I think I was visiting Bath, and Jamie Oliver had opened a restaurant there, so I decided I would go there and I'd try it out. And so I arrived there, and I'm sitting down, and I decide I'm going to order Jamie Oliver's spaghetti bolognese, because I make that to my signature dish, and so I'll just see what this tastes like. And so I ordered a plate of Jamie Oliver's spaghetti bolognese, and I put my fork in it, and I tasted it. Up until that moment, I thought I had been making spaghetti bolognese. And I realised when I put that forkful of food in my mouth that what I had in fact been making was diarrhea in a pan. Because in comparison to Jamie Oliver's spaghetti bolognese, that's kind of what mine tastes like. There's some other comparisons I could draw, like there's a question on the first lunchtime talk that was about Pete Nichols. Pete, you just stand where you are for a moment. There's Pete over there, stay standing Pete. So the question was about what could do more damage, Andy Croft's arms or Pete Nichols' head if they're attacking someone. Before I arrived at Oxford to do this mission, I had quite a high opinion of my arms. I thought I had some pretty serious weapons here. And then when that question came up, I took a good long look at Pete's head, like that. And I imagined it travelling towards me at any sort of velocity. And I was humbled. Thank you, Pete, you may sit down. Sometimes we think we're great, don't we? And then we meet someone and we realise how we pale in comparison. That's what's happened to me when I encountered Jesus Christ. I walked along thinking I was alright, and then I began to really, really look at who He is. And I'm not just saying he's a nice guy and I'm not quite as nice. It's not that He's a bit compassionate and I'm really not that compassionate at all. It's much, much more than that. It's that when I see myself, I see my own selfishness. And when we see Him, the way the Bible describes Him is He's got no sin, no selfishness at all. He is completely selfless. And I realised that I pale in comparison, and that if I were to be in the same, he talks of one of the words we use to describe Jesus is that He's holy, that He's perfect. And seeing Him made me realise that I am, in fact, broken. Seeing myself honestly and seeing Jesus convinced me of my own sin. And the cross is God's way of dealing with it. Because the situation that our sin leaves us in is, number one, we don't want to turn towards God, but number two, even if we did, we couldn't. Because we are broken and sinful, and He is perfect and holy, and holiness and sin, they don't mix, just as light and darkness don't mix. Even if we wanted to, we couldn't turn to Him. So Christians talk about the good news all the time. They always bang on about the good news. That's what the word gospel means. It means good news. The good news is this. That's our state. We cannot get to Him, but He has come to us. He's come to us. That's what the message is. And on the cross, that is the place that He makes a way for us to have a relationship with Him and to turn back to Him and enter back into the relationship for which we were made. It happens on the cross. And if you have your Gospel of Mark with you, why don't you open it? It'll be on the chair. We're going to read about this. And we're going to turn to page 41 to do that. So, flick there with me. And just to put this in context as you're turning there, the whole Gospel of Mark is telling the story of Jesus' life. And when you read it, if you were to take this away and read it, which I would encourage you to if you have time, you see Jesus is like action man. So all the way through, he is just doing miracles and doing all this crazy stuff and casting out demons, and he's just rushing around everywhere, doing good and changing the world until we get to the cross. And then you enter this series of chapters in Mark's Gospel where everything becomes incredibly dark. And Jesus goes from being very, very active to being very, very passive. And there's this word that's used to describe Jesus. That's the word handed over in the Greek that the New Testament was written in. It's used 10 times in 2 chapters. So Jesus goes from rushing around everywhere to suddenly, like a sack of potatoes, being handed over. He allows himself to be arrested. And then this is what happens. When they condemn him to death, we read in verse 16 of chapter 15. The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is the praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him, then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. And they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Again and again they struck him on the head with a staff and spat on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him. Dividing his clothes, they cast lots to see what each would get. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 rebels with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who had passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So, you who are going to destroy the temple and build it up in 3 days, come down from the cross and save yourself." In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe." Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. And at 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of those standing near heard this, they said, "Listen, he's calling Elijah." Someone ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a staff and offered it to Jesus to drink. "Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down," he said. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in 2 from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." And so the first question that we might want to ask from that is, why did Jesus die? Why couldn't God just forgive? If he wanted to have a relationship, have you ever wondered that? Like, if he wanted to have a relationship with us and we've sinned and we've turned away, why doesn't he just sort of say, "Okay, well, I forgive you"? Why this process of Jesus going through the cross? And one of the answers to that Tim Keller points out is he says there's no such thing as forgiveness that doesn't cost someone something. Forgiveness is always costly. And we could use different examples to illustrate this. We could use an economic example. if I lend you my car and you crash into my wall back home and you damage the car, and what I do is I say, okay, I'm going to forgive that debt. That doesn't mean I don't have to pay anything. It means that I'm absorbing the debt and I'm paying it on your behalf. Or if I say, I'm not going to forgive this debt, I want you to pay, then you have to pay it. But it costs something. And that's the same in human relationships. If someone hurts us in some way, is it not the case? You know, when someone does something that really annoys you. I find this sometimes at home with my wife. I'm not really very good at forgiveness, even though I should be. And so she might do something that really winds me up. And I'll decide, okay, I'm a Christian, I'm meant to forgive people. So I will sort of like decide I'm going to forgive. And then she keeps doing it, and she keeps doing it. And I find it rising up inside me. I've just got to so tell you that this annoys me. And I need to let it out, and I have to fight not to do it. And to swallow it, there's a cost to that. Because what you want to do when someone hurts you is you want to hurt them back. It's so much easier just to hurt them back, or at least punish them in some way so that you've got some sort of retribution. To simply take it without responding, what that does is that costs us. We have to absorb that, don't we? I remember just a while ago in Watford, I was walking down my street. This doesn't happen to me very much, but this guy started on me for no reason, just really aggressive, just started on me. And I'm not really very hard. So I didn't really know what to do. So I was just like, okay, I'm just going to back off here. So I backed off. I thought if I had a head like Pete's, I would sort you out, but I don't. So I backed off and I walked away. And I remember after that being just this feeling of anger came up in me, like who does this guy think he is? So I remember when I got back to my room, I'm a very sad human being. When I got back to my room, they all came up and I started like, yeah, come on then. Like there was no one there, but I was like, yeah, come on then, I can take you. And I genuinely was doing that in my room. I was like, what's wrong with me? And I saw him, and I thought I'm going to make peace because he lived on my street. So I saw him a couple of days later, and I just went up to him and I shook his hand and I said, hey mate, you know, just like, I hope there's no hard feelings or whatever. Right, I hadn't done anything to this guy. To do that, most of the time I wouldn't do that. But I thought I've got to do it this time because he'll kick my head in. So, but to do that, it was like a mass. I had to swallow something. I had to die to myself. It cost me. Forgiveness is costly in human relationships. Someone always bears a cost. If we forgive someone, what's happening there is we are in effect bearing their sin against us. So when God comes as the person of Jesus Christ, what he's doing is he's wanting to forgive, but someone always absorbs the cost. He chooses to do it himself. And it was quite a cost. You know, we just read it. You see what they did to Jesus? Cicero called this the most horrific of all tortures. The soldiers, there were only about 600 of them, they beat him and they whipped him with this whip made of leather, but also would have bits of sharp, jagged metal. So they rip the skin off his back and they mock him while they're doing it. And then they shove this crown on his head. And we think crown, we think gold and jewels. Crown made of thorns. They shove it on his head so it digs into his skull. And when they're finished, they've had their way with him, they put this cross on his back, on the back that was bleeding. Eventually he collapses under it, so they have to get this other guy to carry it for him. And you can imagine if the gospel is true, if Jesus is God, as he's walking through those people, he made those people, he created those people, and he's walking through them while they unleash everything they've got at him. Any moment he could have stopped it, and he didn't. And eventually he gets to Golgotha, the place of the skull. And they would have laid him down on this cross, stripped him naked, and nailed through his hands and his feet. Once he was nailed onto the cross, the way that crucifixion works is they raised the cross and it dropped into this socket, so he was dropped through like that. And the way that you were killed through crucifixion was actually that you suffocated, because you were hanging like this, you couldn't breathe. And the only way to breathe would be to push up through the nails that were through your feet to get a breath and to sink down again. And they would hang there for hours, naked and humiliated and in agony. Jesus was hanging there for 6 hours before he died. He took everything the human race could throw at him, the worst sort of death that we had around at the time. He absorbed it on himself. And there's a guy called Sidney Carter who's written a hymn, and he kind of talks about this, and in the hymn he's imagining that he is one of the criminals, or he's speaking as one of the criminals that's hanging there next to Jesus. And he references a guy called Barabbas, who was a criminal that Jesus ended up being crucified instead of. And this is how the words go. It says, "It was on a Friday morning that they took me from the cell, and I saw they had a carpenter to crucify as well. You can blame it on Pilate, you can blame it on the Jews, you can blame it on the devil. It's God I accuse. It's God they ought to crucify instead of you and me," I said to the carpenter, hanging on the tree. Now Barabbas was a killer, and they let Barabbas go, but you are being crucified for nothing here below. And God is up in heaven, and he doesn't do a thing, with 1,000,000 angels watching, and they never move a wing. It's God they ought to crucify instead of you and me, I said to the carpenter, hanging on the tree. And the astonishing biblical revelation is that it was God they crucified. It was him hanging on a tree. And Jesus absorbed that suffering, and that was terrible enough. But do you want to know one of the worst parts, the worst part for Jesus? You see it in, if you look in your New Testament there, you see it in verse 34. It's this cry that he gives. At 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" What is that about? And this is going to feel like a total curveball given what I'm talking about, but I was thinking how to explain this, and I remember I thought back to when I had my first crush. Have you ever had a crush? I'm sure you have. But if you humiliated yourself in the way that I did, if you could go back to see your 13-year-old Facebook status and unfriend yourself, but I would do that. And my first crush was this girl called Frances Patterson, who I fancied for like 3 months, and I just couldn't figure out, I didn't know what I was doing. I just couldn't figure out how to pull the moves on her. And eventually, after 3 months of just obsessing over Frances, and I decided that I was going to have to just go for it, otherwise I was never going to really live. And so the only lesson that we had was swimming. We had swimming lessons together, so I was wearing Speedos, which was a bad start. And I'm there in the swimming pool, and Frances is there in the swimming pool, and I'm just sort of swimming, doing my front crawl, just thinking, come on Andy, you've got to do this, you've got to do this, you've got to do this, you've got to do this. Swimming really, really, really hard. And then eventually there came a moment where Frances surfaced at the shallow end, and I surfaced at the shallow end, and I thought, this is it, do it now. And I was so nervous that I couldn't articulate my words, so instead I just popped up out of the water, looked at her and said, "Put it out of me!" And Frances said, she was a Geordie, I'm from the north of England, she said, "Sorry, what?" And I said, "Do you want to get out of me, Frances?" And I kind of imagined this moment many times as a 13-year-old. I kind of imagined a look of joy coming over Frances's face, a look of at last, and oh my word, those Speedos, they just look so beautiful in them. And all these different reactions. The look that came on her face was one of, when she realised what I was asking, it was just one of horror. And then what was worse was the next one, which was pity. And then she just said, "No, sorry." And I said, "That's okay." And then I was thinking, what do I do now? So the next thing I said is, would you just mind not telling anyone that I asked you out? And you said no. And she said, "Okay then." And then I was just kind of thinking, okay, where do I take the conversation from here? What are you doing that? It's not appropriate, because I was just and then fortunately for me, there was this guy, Greg O'Connell, who had no idea what was going on, who was also in the swimming pool. At that moment, he chose to dunk me under the water from behind. So he just came up and just threw me under the water. And I decided it would be better not to resurface. Just swam away. And, spent most of the rest of my 7 years with Frances Patterson not looking at her. Completely broken. And I'm over it now, alright? I'm over it now. But at the time, I tell you, it hurt. And I'd never really spoken to her, I just admired her in a freaky way from a distance. When you have a sort of a crush on someone, it doesn't quite work out, that's painful, isn't it? It's more painful with a relationship that's established, not necessarily a romantic relationship, a friendship, any relationship that's quite established. When something breaks in that, when something goes wrong in that, that's incredibly painful. How much more painful is it when it's something like a marriage or a parent-child relationship, one that really is meant to be for life? Something in that breaks down. That's psychologically scarring in so many ways. What we believe as Christians is that God, the one God that we worship, is one God, but he exists as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So that the whole of eternity, God is and has been a relationship between the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. And it's not the relationship between God the Son and God the Father is not how it is with our parents, where it's like we wander off and get lost in the supermarket. God the Father and God the Son, from the beginning of eternity, and that's the wrong way of phrasing it, from all of eternity, have never, ever, ever been separated. They've never, ever been apart until now. In this one moment on the cross, what Jesus is doing is he's taking our sin, our separateness from God, our awayness from him, our aloneness without him. He's taking that on himself. So that for a moment in eternity, God the Father is separated from God the Son. So that we never have to be again. Forgiveness is costly, and it cost God the cross. That was the way that he did it. He decided that sin had to be paid for, and it had to be paid for by someone who was a human being, because we're the ones who turned away. But he didn't want to make us pay. So he became a human being. And as a human being, fully man and fully God, he absorbed the cost of forgiveness so that we might be free. Now that sounds crazy, doesn't it? Why would God do that? Even if we look at ourselves, and as we heard at lunchtime, we see us for all of who we are, including our brown with the history and all the things we wish no one ever saw. We see all of that. Why would he do it? Love like this. People do crazy things for love, don't they? Remember when you were a little kid and you threw up everywhere all the time? Who cleaned it up? Mum. Why did Mum clean up? Did she like vomit? Did she love vomit? Did she enjoy vomit? No, she hates vomit. Why does she do it? Because she loves you more than she hates your vomit. God loves us more than he hates our vomit. He loves us more than he hates our mess, which is why he went through the cross. We've talked about the home of Christianity. The cross is the only way in. And it's to receive it. We don't do it. We don't achieve it. It's not in our might. It's not in our power. We just receive what he's done. And then we find freedom. That's why we call it good news. That's why we call it the gospel. And when we encounter the free love of God that loves us just as we are, do you know what happens? It changes who we are. People have been telling stories all week about that. I just want to show you one little video. It's about people's stories of how they met Jesus and were changed. 6 minutes long. Just to say at the start of it, I won't agree necessarily with some of the theological implications that you might pick up, but it makes a point about how when we meet Jesus and we discover that he loves us just as we are, it changes who we are. Here it is. That's just a small snapshot of some people's stories of what happened when they came home and when they came into a relationship with God. The cross makes the way. This is why we call it the good news. Love like this. Die for us. We're going to give a chance at the end of this meeting for anyone who wants to become a Christian tonight. You don't have to, of course you don't. But one or two of you, I think you're ready. You want to give your life to Jesus. There's going to be an opportunity before you leave to turn the card over and to do just that. Before we do that though, we have some question and answers. So if you've got a question about any of this, text it in and might the panel come up and join you and launch straight into that. Okay.
Yeah, we're going to have a time of question and answer now. I expect some of you have questions you want to ask after that talk. And the number is on the screen, so you can text in a question you have. We're going to spend 10 to 15 minutes looking at some of those questions. So let me just introduce the panel with us tonight. Shall I just give you a quick introduction to yourself?
Yes, my name is Pete. I studied in the other place, Oxford Brookes University, affectionately known to some as the Early Learning Centre. and I work for a church in Oxford.
And I'm Peter, so it's reasonably easy to remember, and I'm a minister in a church in Oxford, been here for about 18 years. Before that, I was a vet.
Great, thank you. We're ready to have the first question. Would God be better if he could forgive without it costing him something?
The Bible says that God cares passionately about justice and would not be just if he didn't do something about sin. And actually the Bible is quite unashamed about God's passion for justice. It says we should praise him for it. At the cross, God is just, and that's a good thing. And it wonderfully is merciful, and that's an amazing thing.
I think, I might just add as well, it's an interesting question, isn't it? Would God be better? And I actually find God incredibly attractive because he suffered. I don't know if you find this again in relationships, but when you really love one another, there's some sort of mutual, when one suffers, the other suffers, when one rejoices, the other rejoices. And what we see, because of the cross and because of who God chose himself to be in the cross, is not that he stands at a distance from the pain and suffering in the world, but actually that he enters it and he becomes part of it and he identifies with us in that. And that's one of the reasons that I find him so attractive. And Christianity is the only religion that believes in a God who does do that.
Great, thank you. And then the next question. If God knew that his son was going to come back to life 3 days later, why was his death so painful for him? Surely this was cheating.
Yeah, you could say that, but it was a very, very real death. There was no avoiding that process of death, and there was no avoiding that separation that he endured from God, and indeed God's just punishment falling on him for not for his sins but for our sins. So even though it's clear that there was resurrection hope beyond it, we shouldn't think that his death on the cross was sort of a trivial thing. It was a profound thing. As Andy said, they had enjoyed perfect love and union for eternity past, and there was no reason other than the love of God and one desiring to take the punishment for our sins, that there should be separation, God the Son from God the Father. And there was deep and profound pain in that. I don't think God was cheating in any way.
Thank you. Surely hurting someone demands forgiveness much from them as from God. Much more from them as from God.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it can sort of feel like, they're cheating, isn't it? It's like if my brother does something to annoy me and then God forgives him, it's like, well, hang on a second. I think it comes down to a bit what we were saying the other day when we talked about Jesus, which is Jesus has this interesting habit of wandering around forgiving everybody's sins everywhere. I forgive your sins, and I forgive your sins, and I forgive your sins. And he's acting as if every sin that's ever committed is one that's personally done against him. And that is something that God teaches as true. So again, in the Bible, we see that every sin that's done against God is something that, every sin that's done is something that's done personally against God because it's hurting the world that he created. So I do think it always is going to require forgiveness from God. And then I think forgiveness from others is something that we should be seeking if we hurt them. So I don't think us saying we receive forgiveness from God means we don't have to go and apologise and say sorry to the people around us who, it's not like, well, God forgive me, so stuff you, ha ha ha, I get out of jail free. It's, no, it's very much that we are to go to them as well and seek their forgiveness. That's very much part of what it is to follow Jesus as well. Good question.
Thank you. If God is made man in Jesus, but man is inherently sinful, then is Jesus not also sinful?
Man is sinful because we all belong together in a human race that has collectively gone astray. We put our own little bit into the pot, and we belong to a much bigger story of human beings having gone astray as a whole. So when this person says man is inherently sinful, God made us good, but we have all gone astray. That's what the Bible says. Jesus breaks that. He enters into the world alongside human beings, but it's part of why the Bible says that he was born of a virgin. He breaks that pattern so that now he becomes the first person ever who has broken that bondage that is on all human beings. And then he dies for the sins of the rest of us so that we can belong to him and belong to a new humanity. So Jesus is the only one in history who did not sin. And he managed to break that bondage, which unfortunately every one of the rest of us, including us here, has succumbed to and needs his forgiveness for. Someone may be able to say that clearly.
No, I think you do. I think it's a massive question, isn't it? And I did a degree in theology, and this is the sort of question that made me want to cry and break out the Red Bull. So I think maybe if you're the person that asks this, come up and chat at the end, because I'd love to talk about it a little bit more. It's a really good question. In a nutshell, the Bible teaches that Jesus is like us in every way, except he's without sin. But that sounds very simplistic, doesn't it? So or it can on the surface. So if that's your question, come up and grab me at the end, and we can cry about it together. Try and get somewhere.
Yeah, might also be worth adding that we see this in his life. It's not just theoretical, and that is, we know ourselves that we are sinful, failure to love God and others, and we see something remarkable in Jesus' life. He was without sin and he demonstrated it. He even said at one moment to a group of people, "Can any of you prove me guilty of sin?" And the answer was no.
Thank you. Where did Jesus go when he died? Heaven or hell?
There's lots of theology coming out tonight. Should have done some revising. So big question, good question. It's kind of like the Bible's really clear on some things, and on other things it sort of drops little hints here and there, but it doesn't say very much. So I can't remember exactly where the reference is, but you come up to me afterwards and I'll find it for you. It talks about Jesus going and preaching to people who are in hell. He sort of goes and, it's in Peter, I think, one of Peter's letters, he goes and visits them and sort of shares who he is with them. Exactly the ins and outs of what that means is something that Christians debate, and they talk about it a lot. Ultimately, what we think is that what really matters is our decision as to whether or not we believe in who he is. That's the thing that determines really what shape this takes in our life. So although it's a really fascinating topic, and again I think this is a sort of topic that probably I would buy 10 chocolate oranges before I did this essay, which is my other way of procrastinating. It's a very difficult question to just answer in like 4 sentences. I think come up to me again and we can talk about it. But the key thing I think, is to remember that the obvious stuff of the Bible, which is that he died and that he rose again, is the main and the plain. And the significance of that is the stuff that really is emphasised in the gospel about whether or not we receive him and accept what we call the good news, or whether we just decide not to. So, yeah. Maybe we should phone the person who asked that question so we can know where they are. Not really.
I think we've got time for one more question. People so often seem to find God during times of extreme suffering. Is this not just a way to cope with tragedy?
In some ways it is, but I suppose the reality is that we all suffer and will suffer, and often our suffering, the Bible describes as a gift of God because it brings us to him, which is the reality that we need. So it seems that suffering sometimes draws people away, but often draws people towards God, and in a sense it opens up, it humbles us often, and shows us the reality, which is that we're not as strong as we think. So it's often true, but it's a good thing, I think.
The common denominator that I see is that people find themselves being drawn to God and drawn to Christianity when they actually start to think more deeply about what life is all about. So suffering does that sometimes. Becoming parents does that. I commonly see people saying, well, we've got to rear children, we don't know what values we want to give them, and they come and they start asking deeper questions. Actually, sometimes pleasure does it. Ask me a story which I can't say totally in public about someone who just in extreme pleasure said there must be a God and started hunting and became a Christian. You've drawn your own conclusions. It is when people start to really think about the reality of this world that they then actually start to find Christ very often.
Thank you. I think that's going to be the end of our question and answers. Thank you, panel. We're now going to hear from a current student who, over the past year, has found out about Jesus' love for himself. And he's going to share some of that story with you and what it means to him. So, Tom is from LMH, and he's just going to share a bit of his story.
Thank you. Yeah, so I thought I'd start by saying, a year ago yesterday, I came and sat and listened to a talk, something like this. And when I came, I wasn't a Christian, and when I left, I still wasn't a Christian. Effective talk. But actually, it was the first time that I actually questioned whether or not it could or couldn't be true. And the thing that surprised me about that night was the thing that made me question was not some new clever argument or a fact that I didn't know. It was actually just someone standing at the front and saying, are you being honest with yourself? And the thing that he asked me if I was being honest with myself is my basement. Now, the basement is the place where you put all the things in your life that you regret. All the things in your life that you wish you'd never done. All the things that you wish had never happened to you, make you feel guilty, embarrassed. And the thing is, as far as I was aware when I was listening to this man speak, I have one. But I've got no option. I can't do anything with it. I just try and push it down. So the ugly bits in my life that I never ever want you to know, I just press down further. And I hope they never come up. And I guess the thing is, as he spoke that night, I realised that, hey, I have a basement. I think most people do. I think everyone does. But I don't know how to deal with it. You see, in my basement there are some big things, and there are some small things. One of the big things in my basement happened about two years ago. My mum had an affair. And a few weeks after, I was cooking tea for my dad, because I thought that'd be a nice thing to do, you know. But he came home 45 minutes late, which made me absolutely furious. I felt like he'd taken advantage. And I just sat there and I pushed his buttons, and at the time when my dad needed me most, I just made him feel worse and worse, and I hurt him. And he ended up lashing out, and we ended up having a fight, and I don't mean verbally. And the thing is, I don't know what's in your basement, but that sort of thing has an effect on your life. And as this man spoke last year, I remember thinking about the ways in which this actually did have an effect on my life. And the first thing that I realised was it made me lonely. You see, the thing is, no matter how much I love or care for some of the people in this room, if they never quite know me and the things that I regret and the things that I feel guilty for, and the things that I'm embarrassed by, then there's always a distance between me and them. And it doesn't matter how much I love them, if they don't know me, I just feel like there's no one else there. And the second thing, as I was listening to him speak, was actually I found that I was restless. I was never calm. You know, the thing is, when it's loud and you're with your friends, it's great, isn't it? You enjoy life. But as soon as it's quiet and I was in bed at night on my own, it was just absolutely silent, and there was only me in my basement. And that just stopped me sleeping, because I can remember that day. And the fact that my dad feels guilt for something that I did to him on purpose. That was my decision, and I did that. And when you're alone at night and you feel like you just want to distract yourself, I think it's my basement that does that to me. And the third thing, as I was sat there, which is the irony of the lot, is it made me judgmental. Because the thing is, if I always push down on other people, I lift myself up. If I never look at the problems with myself, then I can get away with thinking everyone else is worse. And that's the real irony of it, isn't it? Because the reason it's there is because I'm not perfect. But to protect myself, I judged others. I guess the thing is, what does this have to do with whether or not there's a God? And the thing that really, really surprised me that evening was as this man spoke and he explained my life, and I'm sat there thinking, yep, you know, I have a basement, I agree with this. He didn't speak from his own opinion or his own authority. He didn't say, I think this or this or this. He actually said, here's a story. It's 10 lines long, it's 2,000 years old. It's a story about a tax collector who's a man in society who would have been quite badly looked down on, and a religious man who would have been reasonably well respected, called a Pharisee. And the Pharisee comes into the temple and he prays, Lord, thank you that I'm not like these other people. I fast for you and I give all my money to charity, 10%. And then there's the tax collector, and the tax collector gets on his knees, he beats his chest and he says, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. And as I listened to him speak, I realised that I was the Pharisee. The Pharisee stood at a distance and he was lonely. And he didn't have any rest, he was always trying to work. I don't know about you, but have you ever had a day where you feel like you can just stop? You've done enough today. Because I always want to work harder. And also he's judgmental, looking down on people saying, at least I'm not like them. See, the thing is, that night when I was sat listening, I realised I've got a basement. But until that night, I never thought there was anything I could do about it. But the thing is, as he spoke, it was the tax collector who had a way of dealing with it. So I went home that night, and for the first time in my life I prayed. I didn't go home a Christian, but I prayed. I said, Lord, if you're there, have mercy on me, a sinner, because I need to change. You see, the thing is, when I used to look at the world and say, I don't like people, the reason I didn't like people is because I never actually looked at my own heart. And so I guess the thing is now is, what do you do about it? Well, I had a lot of questions. Just because someone tells you to look at your own heart doesn't mean you've got all your questions answered. So I went and I asked some friends my questions, and I went along to the discussion group. It was called Born Loved last year, and this year it's called Love Examined. And I went along and I asked some genuine questions. And the other thing I did is I read this book. This is Luke's Gospel, and I got halfway through it, and everything Andy said about Jesus tonight, I believe. And because he was perfect, and he can actually help me with my basement, and I'm willing to trust him with my life. And a year later I can say to you that I'm no longer lonely. And at night I sleep. That doesn't mean I'm perfect. I'm never going to be perfect. but I can actually have a life where I feel loved and where I know I'm never on my own. And if Jesus is who he says he is, then everyone in this room has that opportunity too. And I really, really hope you think about it. Cheers.
And there'll be other opportunities, but one opportunity is now. And just to sum up what we've been saying this week, maybe this is the first evening you've come, I know for some of you it is. What we've been saying is that if Christianity is like a house, inside what we find is in a world that is full of craziness, we find peace. In a world where we feel sometimes dead inside, we've got stuff in the basement, we come alive inside. In a world where we're looking for relationship, we find relationship with Jesus Christ. In a world where we're wondering what God is like, he's revealed to us in the Bible and shows us how he views the world. And the entrance to the house is the cross. There's one final story in 2 seconds I'll say. Jesus talks about a father who has 2 sons. One of them says to the dad, I've had it, I'm leaving, I'm taking half of your money. And he goes and he wastes the money. It's called the story of the prodigal son, maybe you've heard it. And after spending the money and finding he doesn't get what he's looking for, he decides to come home. He turns around, he walks home. As he's walking, he's thinking, I cannot believe I did that to my dad. I cannot believe I wasted all that money. I can't believe I've done this to myself. He'll never take me back. He'll never take me back. He'll never take me back. So he's practicing this speech. Hey Dad, let me just work as one of your servants. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son, I'll just be a servant. And the father is waiting at the house for this guy to come home. He sees him in the distance, and then what he does, and this is a picture of what God does for us in that 2,000-year-old story he told. The father goes running to the son. The son, when he sees the father, he starts his speech, hey Dad, I'm no longer worthy to be called. And the father just cuts him off. He says, I'm so happy you are home. Here, let's have a party, let's have a barbecue, kill the fatted calf, we're going to celebrate. What it is to come into the house is not, as I used to think, to come into a religion full of rules and morality that meant you just had to be incredibly boring for the rest of your life. It was an invitation to a party in the Father's house. And the whole of this week has been building up to one question. Do you want to come home? Do you want to come home? So, what we're going to do is, in a moment, we're going to close our eyes, and if you're here, and you've been coming to some of this stuff, and you just decide, yeah, do you know what? I really do. I really do want to give my life to Jesus. And you know what I was saying about, he takes everything, so it is everything. But we get all of him. If you know that's you, in a moment when everyone's got their eyes closed, just so I know who you are, I'm not going to point you out to anyone. I would love it if you would just raise your hand in the air. And then when people have raised their hands and we know who, what's what, then what I'll do is I'll say a prayer. And in that moment, you just pray that with me and say amen. Father, I'm so sorry that I've wandered away from the house. I'm so sorry that I've turned my back on you. I'm so sorry that I'm sinful. I see that now. And in this moment, right now, I repent. I turn around. I come back to you. I want to come home. And I thank you for the cross and for the fact that it means you receive me with open arms. I give the whole of who I am to you. And I pray that you would fill me with your life, your peace, your love, your truth, now and for all eternity. Amen. Amen. Those of you who prayed that prayer, you have just received the forgiveness of Jesus Christ. And I'd encourage you, one of the first things to do is to tell someone you came with that you did it. And if you don't tell them, I know who you are, so I'll go up to them. Not really. I might do, you never know. Tell tell them. Tick the box on the response card as well, so that we know, so we can get in touch with you. It will be an encouragement to us. So please do tick that. But tell them as well, because you just started a journey.